Hello and welcome to episode 3 of the podcast review series. We've got a lot to get through on this one, so I'm going to get straight in. The podcast was the Barbell Life, so Travis Mash's Barbell Life, episode 342, How Strong is Too Strong. Now, I did listen to it initially because I thought it'd be about weightlifting, but it wasn't very heavily about weightlifting. It was a bit more about sprinting and S&C and other sports, but it was very interesting. Got a lot through. There's no special guests, but they got through quite a lot. So the first thing that the first note that I took, that they said that if your squat goes up, say it goes up from I think they gave 500 to 700 pounds, but your relative strength goes down. You put on loads of weight, maybe. Your actual relative strength goes down. You will get slower. That's just it. You will get slower. So it doesn't really matter how strong you are maximally. If you relative strength is obviously is one of the biggest, if not the biggest, key determinant of speed. The fastest people in the world are the strongest people in the world compared to their body weight in a lot of ways. Not necessarily 100 meters, because obviously there's a lot of technique that goes into it as well. But if you were to get 15 rugby players who'd never done sprint training before, I would argue that probably the fastest one is probably the one who's strongest relative to their body weight. And a lot of that comes down to body fat percentage. So if you get leaner, you will probably sprint better. Fat doesn't move well. I guess it's useful for like linemen or props maybe in rugby, or who don't want to be moved well. But then obviously they sacrifice speed at the expense. So they did say though that squatting is imperative. Trav Mash obviously loves squatting, full depth squatting. So obviously very opposite from what we were talking about with Mike Boyle, who does not love squatting. But it's because force is the key determinant in all three of Newton's laws. So in the law of inertia, acceleration, and reaction, which obviously you can look up on your own if you don't know, force is the key constant in all of them. So if you up your force, everything else will go up. Now, if you up your force, like we've said, if we up your force by, just say, an arbitrary unit of 1, but you up your body weight by 50, then your force hasn't really gone up relative to body weight. If you up your force by 1 and your body weight by 0, then you know you've done something right. But usually when you if you up one thing, you'll find something else to up. So they did talk about continually kind of updating development. They talked about, and this isn't just from a performance standpoint, but so for me, for example, I've done a lot of work on my upper body, because that's the weakness for weightlifting. And I think at some point, I haven't got there yet, but I think at some point I'll get to the point where I probably need to address something else. That's probably the main issue at the moment, but we're doing a lot of speed and power stuff with the lower body with jumps. And that, I think, to be honest, that will keep the majority of my strength. I think I can afford to lose a little bit of strength, and it's not the end of the world in terms of like front squat strength, for example. But I think at some point my upper body strength will be negligible how much I increase it, and then I'll have to work on something else. But that's just from a performance standpoint. For me, it's things like trying to get to bed earlier, for example, trying to update that, diet, stretching, and the kind of day-to-day things. I think if you obviously, everyone knows this, but if you really care about performance, it's got to be something that you do 100% of the time. I think a lot of people only care about performance when they're in the gym, but then will go and stay up all night partying or whatever. And that's up to them, and that's absolutely fine if they do want to do that, but they have to take the consequences that come with that. And similarly, I think that people have to take the consequences of being, committed to the sport as well, because there obviously are some. But yeah, you just expect the results from what you put in, really, and then you can't go wrong. If you want to, maintain an active social life and you don't want to give up certain things, then you're probably more happy than me, to be honest. So fair play. They talked about, this is a little brief tangent, but they talked about a world not world, but in America anyway, NBA coach, who the best in America, one of the best S&C coaches in America, and for some, I don't know who it was, I forgot, but his team, and this was the basketball, his team kept getting hamstring injuries. And they were a great team, some of the best players. And they kept getting hamstring injuries, like nearly all of them. And they looked at the S&C program, and it was a great program. Everything was right, but the one thing they did wrong was they kept RDLs at 70 kilos throughout. So every other thing they increased linearly, which is obviously quite a good thing, but they kept RDLs 70 kilos. And I don't know why they thought this was a good idea, but obviously they did this. What happened was they got massive discrepancies between the quads and the hamstrings. Hamstrings got a lot weaker and the quads got a lot stronger and tighter. And thus hamstrings injuries kept occurring. So that kind of led them on to talk about balance a bit. And again, this goes back to what I was said in the last review about what my coach Chris, I guess, preaches a lot. Is being strong in all three planes and being balanced and being a good athlete over being a good, being a great athlete first, developing that base. Louis Simmons talked about, Louis Simmons being the founder of Westside Barbell. The base is, the peak is only as high as the base. So build the base as wide as you can, and the peak will get higher and higher, which makes a lot of sense. Increasing stride length. Now this is an interesting one. I think there's some carryover to weightlifting here, but increasing stride length for sprinting, you want to do it by not cueing them at all. Obviously, if you cue someone to increase their stride length, they're going to overstride and they're going to put braking forces into the ground by landing in front of the center of mass. Now, if you can elicit a change, if they have now this is interesting for me because I have Devontae, and I think his stride length could be improved, but also you've got to take into account limb lengths and whatnot, but trying to up his stride length, what I might try and work on is just lengthening his hip flexors and his psoas. So there's more potential energy or more chance, he can go through more range essentially, out the back door anyway. And I think this is similar to weightlifting in the sense that if you have someone who is limited in mobility wise, but what's a good example? If they're let's just say the bottom position, that they're always catching things a little bit funny in the bottom position. I think Dario might be a good example of this. So Dario, being one of my weightlifters, great lifter, great technique in the pull, but when we first started, his overhead position in the snatch was never fantastic. He'd always lose things forward, usually lose things forward, and we actually thought it was down to his just mobility, to be honest, but then us saying to him try to be more upright in the catch, because obviously he was leaning forward because his knees wouldn't pass over his toes loads. I think that would cause some shoulder issues, obviously, because he was maybe overextending at the thoracic and getting his shoulders too far back and his head still being forward. Once his ankles loosened up, which did take time, like anyone, but they have got a lot better, his overhead position is a lot better now. So now I think his next lowest hanging fruit is, he was a little bit similar to me, is a bit of upper body strength and stability. So we've got him on the bench press, for example, and I think that's working quite well. These things take a lot of time, and especially with athletes who play other sports as well, it seems to take a little bit longer in some ways. Like, I guess May is a good example. Obviously, she was basically elite level sprinter for years, and then she'll get, her natural tendency is she's so elastic and stretch shortening cycle kind of thing that her default is to be super elastic and always move very, very, very fast, and she's lost a bit of stability. But when she's getting her stability up now with the weightlifting training, and she's making great progress, and I think Dario will be the same. I think once he, because he has all these inbuilt patterns from ice hockey, not necessarily inbuilt patterns, but he's got specific, parts of his body that are tighter or looser or stronger or weaker. And once we get in the upper body stability back up, he'll be good to go. But So that was about lengthening stride. But then from that and the potential energy, they talked a lot about strain energy, which Trav Mash seems to think is the next big thing in S&C. Basically, it's strain energy. If I remember correctly, it's a type of potential energy, so it's kind of a stored energy that's to be used, but it's from changes in like deformation in muscle. So you get it a lot in the foot and the Achilles, and then which is really useful. And you can use isometrics to strengthen the joints at specific angles. So if you want to strengthen the Achilles tendon, for example, now we know that isometrics are very good for not just strengthening the muscle but also the joints, more so than eccentrics and concentrics probably. But if we want to strengthen the Achilles tendon, we'll do something in a dorsiflexed but not fully dorsiflexed, definitely not plantar flexed position. You'll strengthen that position. So let's just say an arbitrary number of 90 degrees of ankle dorsiflexion. Achilles tendon will be stretched a little bit. You'll get stronger in that position, plus or minus up and down a few degrees. Now, they did mention do that with straight knees, obviously. If you only do it with bent knees, you'll never get the gastrocnemius. Sorry, you'll never get the gastrocnemius and the soleus lengthened. Obviously, if you do it with straight knees, you'll lengthen the gastroc. You talked about using these isometrics to build or create the matrix of strength in that joint tissue as well as the muscle, and then doing things like bounding and plyometrics to create that interconnected strength and power, that kind of web of strength and power. That is that isometrics base is the base of the joints strength, and then utilizing bounding and plyometrics and hopping and whatnot will bring the muscles in play as well as utilizing the elastic energy stored in the strain energy stored in the Achilles and other passive joints or passive structures. So that was really interesting. And then they finally talked about the role of the muscle spindles. Now, probably most people listening might know what this is, but if you've not done anatomy or SSC, there's absolutely no reason why you would know this, which is fair enough. But muscle spindles are, I don't think they're nerves, but I couldn't actually tell you what they are. But they essentially they react. They must be nerves, I think. I'll look into that. That's something for me to look into, what they actually specifically are. But they run alongside the muscles, and when the muscle is stretched, for example, they send signals to the brain saying we're getting stretched too far, or we've reached peak stretch, and so then they contract the muscle. So they kind of fight against the stretch, which is what the stretch reflex is. So that's why a lot of people can jump higher if they jump off a box than if they just do a vertical jump from the ground. They get a little bit extra stretch reflex. So as you land, let's say the soleus and the gastrocnemius, well, we'll say the soleus just for one. As the knees bend forward, the soleus will lengthen. At some point at the bottom of the counter movement, the muscle spindles will panic and say to the brain, we need to contract hard, and they'll contract alongside the muscle voluntarily contracting them. So it's kind of a double whammy. Whereas if you take away the stretch reflex by, for example, jumping down into the counter movement, pausing, the muscle spindle switch gets turned off, and then all you have is the voluntary contraction of the muscles rather than the voluntary and the involuntary. So they're really useful, and you can use things like PNF to kind of create new range by turning off the muscle spindles, but that's probably a topic for another time. But yeah, this was a really good podcast. They didn't the how strong is too strong talk was kind of only at the start, so I was expecting it to be like give a perfect figure for how much your front squat should be over your clean jerk, because that's very relative to me. But they didn't talk about that, but that's okay. Maybe I'll do that myself. But yeah, that's it. That's this one. Episode 3. This was the Barbell Life, episode 342. How strong is too strong? I'll see you next time. By the way, this is my sleeping shirt or my pajama shirt, so that's why I always wear it.